Hi everyone, this is our third lecture. I'm talking today about landscape corridors, and just want to remind that our readings this week is the chapter on corridors from Foreman and Gordon, and it's available on the Blackboard for you. And also we are continuing to work with our little book on landscape ecology principles in landscape architecture and land use planning, and you are working on your own with a part on corridors and connectivity, and please make sure to work through the case study because our second quiz will be based on corridors and connectivity. In landscape ecology, all linear features, regardless of what is their size or scale, are considered as corridors. Some of them can be huge, such as the Amazon or the Nile Valley. Some of them can be tiny, such as a biking trail. But they all provide the same functions, and they all facilitate movement through the landscape. That's why corridors are extremely important. They link different patches together, allow movement of species, or population movement, or flow of energy or materials, or movement of humans through the landscape. Landscape corridors can be natural or man-made. Examples include rivers and streams, greenways, roads, trails, canals, and hedges. Just like landscape patches, landscape corridors can be classified based on their origin, based on the processes that have shaped and created them within the landscape. Disturbance corridors are caused by disturbances, and these disturbances can be natural or man-made or anthropogenic disturbances. Examples of corridors created by disturbances include fire burns, areas formed by water erosion or wind or logging or strip mining, any kind of processes that lead to destruction of the original matrix vegetation along the lines. Usually this type of disturbances is happening along the roads or power lines, but sometimes it can just happen because of the natural processes following the direction of the wind or following the pattern of distribution of certain pests or diseases. Remnant corridors are also caused by disturbances, but this is an inverse mechanism that we see compared to disturbance corridors. In case of remnants, the entire matrix is modified by the disturbance, and there is only remnant vegetation or remnant landscape features that remain along as a linear feature within the landscape. So, for example, a tree line surviving natural or anthropogenic disturbance on both sides would be an example of a remnant corridor. Sometimes remnant forest vegetation can survive only along hydrographic network. So this would be an example of both environmental resource corridor, which is the river, but also remnant vegetation that would survive along the river. Environmental resource corridors are all kind of natural features within the landscape, all kind of linear natural features. So again, the hydrographic network would be the prime example of environmental resource corridors. Regenerated corridors are areas that recover through the natural succession after disturbances. For example, an area could be disturbed by a forest fire, or it could be intentionally modified by farming or other agricultural activities, and later, or when it is restored, it would regenerate. And if it regenerates along the linear, creating linear features, this would lead to formation of regeneration corridors. For example, forest can regenerate just along the power lines, and that will be an example of regenerated corridor. Finally, introduced corridors are all kinds of linear features that are created intentionally by people in the landscape. Examples include planted corridors such as tree lines or hedges, anything which is planted in the landscape. Canals, all kinds of hydrographic features also created by humans, the so-called blue infrastructure, and all kinds of built features, or so-called gray infrastructure such as walls, dams, dikes, any linear features that are created by humans intentionally. There are three basic types of corridors based on their structure. Their size and scale can vary tremendously depending on what is the scale of our landscape observations, but at any scale, we can identify these three basic structures: lines, strips, and streams. The line corridors are the simplest in terms of their structure. Those are very narrow bands as we observe them at the scale of our landscape observation. This can include paths, roads, trails, roadsides, fences, property boundaries, power lines, drainage ditches, irrigation channels, and so on. All these are very simple features that we usually just identify as line without being very interested in the structure inside of this line. The second type of corridors are the so-called strips. We think of them as bands, as ribbons. We are actually finding their internal structure pretty interesting because they're relatively wide, again, at the scale of our landscape observation compared to the surrounding matrix and compared to the size of surrounding patches. So examples could include wide hedgerows, when we're actually interested not only in the edge, but also what is inside of the hedgerow. This could include wooded strips of wood. This could include any kind of bands of farmland that is shaped as a linear feature. And finally, the third group are the so-called stream corridors. They are associated with a hydrological network. Those can be bands of riparian vegetation along watercourses. The stream corridors are typically natural, but they can be also man-made, such as canals. Canals are essentially artificial rivers. So the stream corridors are usually the most complex because they include not only the blue infrastructure, not only water, it could be river or creek or canal, but they also includes the bands of vegetation around and the entire structure that is created by the hydrological network. So if we think of Grand River in Grand Rapids, it includes not just the river itself, it also includes the river banks. If we're thinking about the creek by campus, we would also think not just the water in the creek, but the entire system associated by this stream corridor. Regardless of their origin, size, and structure, all corridors play very important ecological roles in various landscapes. There are 5 basic functions that many landscape corridors provide within the landscapes. These functions are conduit, barrier or filter, habitat, source, and sink. Some corridors provide all these 5 functions. Some of them provide only 1 or 2. We are going to look more in depth at each of these 5 functions. The conduit function is perhaps the most obvious and is very well understood. Examples of conduit corridors include streams or hedgerows or roads. All these linear features allow species or various materials to move across the landscape. We all are using corridors that perform this conduit function every day without really thinking about it. But if we think beyond just the experience of humans, many other linear features perform the same function for other animal species. For example, roadside vegetation, the so-called verges, or hedgerows along the agricultural field, provide an important function of conduit for many animal species. The second function of linear features within the landscape is a function of barrier or filter. And this is also pretty obvious. The same linear feature that can serve us as a conduit could also be a barrier. It depends if we want to travel on the river in our kayak or we're actually trying to cross the river in the area where there is no bridge. The same linear features can act as barriers when they completely stop and prevent the movement, or they can just slow us down across the landscape, like this little stream. We could still cross it, and so it would be more appropriate to think of it as a filter, at least for humans, rather than a complete barrier. The third ecological function provided by linear features within the landscape is the function of habitat. This is particularly true for strip and stream corridors, and less likely for very narrow line corridors. Hedgerows, rivers, canals, greenways all provide home for various plant and animal species. They also provide recreational resources for humans. Narrow corridors are usually more suitable for edge species as opposed to interior dwelling species, which need much wider amount of habitat to survive. This is why the minimal width of desired corridor should be considered by land use planners based on species ecology and also based on human recreational needs and landscape aesthetics when we think about recreational green spaces. The fourth function provided by many corridors in the landscape is the function of source. A corridor can act as a source of material or energy or species which provide both species or materials into the surrounding matrix. This can apply to pollution or seeds or pollination. For example, a road can act as a source of pollution going into the surrounding matrix, or a hedge can be a source of seeds of plants going also into the surrounding matrix. And finally, the sink function is exactly the opposite to the function of a source within the landscape. A corridor can act as a reservoir that is a sink. It absorbs species or material or pollen or seeds from the surrounding matrix. An example of a sink function of the corridor could be seeds or soil particles that become trapped in a hedgerow or in the roadside vegetation. Here are a few examples of landscape corridors that we can find in many parts of the world. One of them are hedgerows. In fact, landscape ecology originates and owes many of its concepts to the studies of hedgerows in Western Europe in the 19th century. Hedgerows are the living fences, and they provide forage and shelter and barrier for livestock. They can also be used as boundaries for agricultural lands, providing visual barrier. They're also very aesthetically pleasing. They function as important habitat for plants and animals and also as conduits for those species. They improve microclimate. Hedgerows can improve microclimate and hydrology dramatically. They can also improve the quality of soils by retaining their moisture. Hedgerows can be also used for preventing erosion if they are planted at 90 degrees to the slope gradient, and they're especially valuable in joining fragmented forest patches of remaining vegetation. They are ideal habitat for edge species, and we can find them in various forms in many parts of the world, both in rural and in urban landscapes. Another very important and very prominent group of corridors that can be found almost anywhere around the world are, of course, riparian vegetation associated with stream corridors. Stream corridors provide many ecological functions and ecosystem services that are extremely important for the entire landscape, and this includes, of course, function of habitat for many species. It also includes function of conduit. They provide very important recreational resources for humans. They provide soils. They protect streams from sediment loading from the surrounding agricultural fields. They also provide a filter from the pollution by pesticides from the agricultural fields. Shortly, riparian vegetation is extremely important, and we do need to protect those corridors that are increasingly important at the time of landscape fragmentation. And the last but not the least, I want to emphasize the important ecological role played by verges. Verges is roadside vegetation, and it usually develops when we simply don't manage the roadsides, when we don't mow them. This roadside vegetation can serve as an important place for conduit or habitat or as a source of food for very small animals, for pollinators. This is a place for local vegetation for the native species. And verges can play a very important role protecting the surrounding matrix. For example, agricultural lands or rangelands or urban environments from protection caused by the transportation network. So verges can provide roadside soil, they can filter pollution, they can improve the quality of water and air, they can slightly reduce the noise coming from the roads. They are playing important roles, they play important part of the urban green infrastructure and should be more seriously considered by urban planners. Unfortunately, very often verges are destroyed because they're considered as weeds. They're threatened by mowing and burning and chemical runoff, and they're very often destroyed, which really prevents them from performing very important ecological functions. They're very low maintenance, and if managed properly, they can play much more prominent role in our landscapes. So this week we're exploring corridors in your study areas. I hope that you would examine and catalog all the linear features within your case study area as you start developing your projects. The Lab 2 would help you with this as well. And as always, please email me if you have any questions. And I hope to see you all in the tutorial tomorrow at 10 a.m. and we will speak more about linear features within the landscapes.